Welcome to my YouTube channel, Everything Medical. Today's video, we shall be telling the embryological stories about the development of the larynx and the trachea. I've made video on the overview of the development of the respiratory system, that is, those structures that forms the respiratory system. I've made the videos, right? So do well to go and watch it so that you know how the structures that are composed of the respiratory system get evolved. Their developmental origin, which is from the laryngotrachea diverticulum or the respiratory diverticulum. Before we proceed forward, if you are coming across to my channel at the first time, don't forget to subscribe. Yes, and don't forget to subscribe so that you get notification when we upload video on human anatomy, and also comment and share our videos. Yes, let's proceed. This diagram here depicts the developmental processes on how larynx evolve, while this one here depicts the developmental stages on how trachea get evolved, right? So we shall be starting from the larynx first before the trachea. You have to understand that the respiratory system developed from the laryngotrachea diverticulum, right? Developed from the ventral aspect of the cranial part of the foregut, right? That is where it evolved. It developed from the ventral, which is the anterior, and cranial, which is the upper part or the superior aspect of the foregut, right? That is where it evolved. So the structure that forms the respiratory system developed from the laryngotrachea diverticulum, arising from the ventral aspect of the cranial part of the foregut. And the lining is usually an endoderm. That means the lining that lies the respiratory structures are endodermal in origin, right? So, the first thing first is the introduction. The introduction. The larynx is an essential part of the respiratory system. It developed from the cranialmost part of the laryngotrachea diverticulum or the respiratory diverticulum. That is where larynx evolved from. It developed from the cranialmost part of the laryngotrachea diverticulum or the respiratory diverticulum. You have to understand that as the laryngotrachea diverticulum is developing from the ventral aspect of the cranial part of the foregut, its distal aspect is being separated from the oesophagus by the tracheoesophageal septum, right? Now watch. Watch here. This is the foregut, right? This is the foregut. This is the laryngotracheal diverticulum or the respiratory diverticulum. Right? Now, this is the tracheoesophageal fold because it is the fusion of the tracheoesophageal fold that led to the formation of the tracheoesophageal septum, which separate the distal aspect of the laryngotracheal diverticulum from the oesophagus, right? Failure to the fusion of the tracheoesophageal fold to form the tracheoesophageal septum will lead to an anomaly of the trachea and the oesophagus, which is called tracheoesophageal fistula. Pay attention. Now, this is the tracheoesophageal fold, right? tracheoesophageal fold. This also remains the foregut. This is usually oesophagus. Usually from the oesophagus, right? This is also the tracheoesophageal fold, right? This remains the respiratory diverticulum. Right? Now, as the respiratory diverticulum is developing from the ventral aspect of the cranial part of the foregut, the distal aspect of the respiratory diverticulum is separated from the oesophagus by the tracheoesophageal septum, which was formed as a result of the fusion of the tracheoesophageal fold. There is a septum here, a partition, a septum here, which separates the foregut, which led to the formation of the oesophagus. That is why the foregut forms the oesophagus, right? So here is the oesophagus, right? So that septum is here, which separates the oesophagus. That is why they are like this. If not because of that septum here, there wouldn't have been clear separation of the trachea from the oesophagus. So it is because of the presence of that word tracheoesophageal septum, which was formed as a result of the fusion of the tracheoesophageal fold, right? That is what that led to the separation of the trachea from the oesophagus. But the cranial aspect of the laryngeotracheal diverticulum chooses to become continuous, thereby forming a communication between the primitive pharynx and that of the laryngeotracheal diverticulum. So once there's a communication between the laryngeotracheal diverticulum, that is its cranial aspect, and the primitive pharynx, they create an inlet. That inlet is called the laryngeal inlet or the laryngeal orifice. Look at it here. This is that inlet. It is called laryngeal inlet or the laryngeal orifice. The laryngeal inlet was created as a result of the communication between the cranial aspect of the laryngeotracheal diverticulum and the primitive pharynx. That is what that led to the formation of the laryngeal inlet, right? This remains the epiglottis. This remains the arytenoid swelling. Arytenoid swelling. You have to understand that the mesenchyme of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch surrounds the laryngeal orifice. I repeat, the mesenchyme of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch surrounds the laryngeal orifice, thereby proliferating. Because as it surrounds the laryngeal orifice, it begins to what? To proliferate. As a result of that proliferation, it led to the T-shaped slit-like laryngeal orifice, which is at this state. While the laryngeal inlet or orifice is in the T-shaped manner, is because of the proliferation of the mesenchyme of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch. Because as the mesenchyme of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch surrounds the laryngeal inlet or the laryngeal orifice, it proliferates. as it proliferates, it led to the formation of the T-shaped slit-like laryngeal orifice, right? So this is the T-shaped laryngeal orifice or inlet. T-shaped laryngeal orifice. This was formed as a result of the proliferation of the mesenchyme of fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch. Mesenchyme of fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch. So when it proliferates around or surrounding the laryngeal inlet, as a result of the proliferation, it led to the T-shaped laryngeal orifice. Because that you call it a slit-like T-shaped laryngeal orifice, right? You have to understand that again, that the mesenchyme of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch forms the cartilage of the larynx, which includes the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, the arytenoid cartilage, and also the cuneiform cartilage, right? By that time, the laryngeal orifice has formed a characteristic adult shape. Now, this is the adult shape of the laryngeal orifice. All this shape is just like the developmental process to form the adult shape. This remains the epiglottis swelling, epiglottal swelling, because it has not fully formed at this state. Now, this is how the epiglottis looks like. So this is epiglottis, right? Now, this shape is an adult-shaped laryngeal orifice. This is an adult-shaped what? Laryngeal orifice. All this shape was the developmental processes, right? So this is an adult-shaped laryngeal orifice. This remains the arytenoid swelling. Right? The lining epithelium, the next outline, the lining epithelium. Now, the lining epithelium of the larynx is formed by the endoderm, derived from the laryngotracheal diverticulum. That means it is being formed by the endoderm. The lining epithelium of the larynx is being formed by the what? By the endoderm, right? Now, before that, the endodermal cells that lies the larynx will become completely proliferated and obliterate the lumen of the larynx. They'll become what? Completely proliferated and obliterate the lumen of the larynx. As they obliterate the lumen of the larynx, they begin to do what? To undergo breakdown, so that the recanalization of the larynx will take place. Because because the canalization of the larynx is essential for the development of the full larynx. So during the recanalization of the larynx, those endodermal cell chooses to form two pair of fold called the upper fold and the lower fold. The upper fold is called the vestibular fold, while the lower fold is called the vocal fold. We have two folds. The two folds, we have vestibular fold and vocal fold. This was formed as a result of the recanalization of the larynx. Recanalization. This was formed as a result of the recanalization of the larynx, which forms the vestibular fold and the vocal fold. Because at first, those endodermal cells that lines the larynx will become completely proliferated and obliterate the lumen of the larynx. Right? Just before that, those endodermal cells will begin to break down, to undergo what breakdown, so that the recanalization of the larynx will take place. Now, during recanalization of the larynx, these two fold was formed as a result of the recanalization of the larynx. Because at first, the endodermal cells which lines the larynx will begin to completely proliferate and obliterate the lumen of the larynx. As they do so, those endodermal cells will undergo breakdown, so that recanalization of the larynx will take place. During the recanalization of the larynx, it led to the formation of two folds, the upper fold and the lower fold. The upper fold is called the vestibular fold, while the lower fold is called the vocal fold. These two folds will extend on anteroposterior direction on the lumen of the larynx in order to form the true and false vocal cord. They choose to form the two of them extend on the anteroposterior direction on the lumen of the larynx to form true and false vocal cord. They form true and false what? Vocal cord. Now, at the tip of the vocal cord, there exists a lateral recess which was formed by the fold called the laryngeal ventricle. That lateral recess is called laryngeal ventricle. Lateral recess is called laryngeal ventricle. Laryngeal ventricle, right? Now, you have to understand that all the cartilage of the larynx, all the cartilages of the larynx, such as the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, the arytenoid cartilage, and the cuneiform cartilage, develop from the mesenchyme of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch, except the epiglottis. The epiglottis is developed from the caudal aspect of the hypobranchial eminence, which is cranial to the laryngotracheal groove, right? So the epiglottis evolved from different regions, while other cartilages of the larynx develop from the mesenchyme of the fourth and sixth laryngeal and sixth pharyngeal arch, whereas epiglottis develop from the caudal aspect of the hypobranchial orifice, eminence, not orifice, which is cranial to the laryngeotracheal groove. However, the muscles of the larynx develop from the mesoderm of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch, derived from the neural crest cell. Therefore, the nerve supply is derived from the first arch, nerve to fourth arch, called the superior laryngeal nerve, and also the nerve to sixth arch, called the recurrent laryngeal nerve, right? So those are the two nerves that innervate the muscles of the larynx. The first one, which is called the superior laryngeal nerve, derived from the nerve of the fourth arch, whereas the recurrent laryngeal nerve is derived from the nerve of the sixth arch. So those are their developmental origins of the cartilages of the larynx and also the muscles of the larynx and the nerve that innervate them, right? So that is all about the development of the larynx. Recall that this remains the arytenoid swelling. Arytenoid swelling, right? Okay, now the trachea develop. Now let's give an introduction to the trachea introduction. Trachea developed from the part of the laryngotracheal diverticulum between the larynx and the point of bifurcation or division of the laryngotracheal diverticulum, giving rise to the bronchial bud and the long bud per se. Now what? Recall that it is by the separation or the activity of the tracheoesophageal septum that led to the separation of the laryngotracheal diverticulum from the esophagus, right? That is why they are in this way. Now, the trachea develop from the part of the laryngotracheal diverticulum between the larynx and the point of bifurcation, which give rise to the two bronchial bud and the long bud, right? So these are the two bronchial bud. Which can also be called the long bud also. Now, the bronchial bud give rise to the bronchis and also the long parenchyma, right? Whereas the trachea develop from the part of the laryngotracheal diverticulum between the larynx and the point of bifurcation. You can see this is the point of the bifurcation, the division, which give rise to the what? Bronchial bud, right? So the bronchial bud give rise to the bronchis, right? It gives rise to the bronchis, right? Whereas the trachea developed from the point of the bifurcation, which give rise to the bronchial bud, right? So this is the trachea. Why this is the esophagus? If not because of the activity of the tracheoesophageal septum, there wouldn't have been separation of the esophagus and the trachea. That is why the tracheoesophageal fold is important for its fusion, because when it fuses, it forms the what? The tracheoesophageal septum, which separate the esophagus from the trachea, right? If it fails to form, which is the tracheoesophageal fold, it will lead to what? Tracheoesophageal fistula, which is TF. Tracheoesophageal what? Fistula. I will still explain it when I enter clinical correlation of the development of the larynx and also the trachea. So, they record that the endoderma or the lining epithelium of the trachea develop or is being formed by the endoderm of the laryngotracheal diverticulum. Same thing as that of the larynx. The lining epithelium is usually the endoderm of the laryngotracheal diverticulum, right? That is how it's being formed, right? Now, the muscles, the cartilages, and the connective tissues of the trachea develop from the splachnopluric intraembryonic mesoderm surrounding the laryngotracheal diverticulum. That is how it evolved. The muscles, the cartilage, and the connective tissues of the trachea develop from the splachnopluric intraembryonic mesoderm surrounding the laryngotracheal diverticulum. So that is how it is being formed. We call that the esophagus develop from the foregut directly, develop from the foregut, right? So it has to get separated by the activity of the tracheoesophageal septum, formed by the fusion of the tracheoesophageal fold, right? So that is how it is being done. So here remains the esophagus. We have stated it, right? So the next thing we shall be discussing is the clinical correlation. The clinical correlation. Clinical correlation. Number one is laryngeal atresia stroke stenosis. Atresia means blockage, while stenosis means narrowing, right? Atresia means blockage, while stenosis means narrowing. So, laryngeal atresia and stenosis is one of the rare anomaly of the larynx, whereby there is a failure of the recanalization of the larynx, leading to obstruction of the larynx, right? It leads to the obstruction of the upper respiratory tract, right? And it occurs as a result of the failure of the recanalization of the larynx. And laryngeal atresia or stenosis can be called congenital high airway obstruction syndrome because there is an obstruction of the larynx, right? Because of failure of the recanalization of the larynx, right? Leading to obstruction of the upper respiratory tract. So that is all about the laryngeal atresia and the stenosis, right? The next one is laryngeal web. Laryngeal web occurs as a result of the presence of the membranous web-like tissue in the lumen of the larynx, right? It is the presence of the membranous web-like tissue in the lumen of the larynx, thereby causing obstruction of the larynx. And this laryngeal web, which is the membranous web-like tissue in the lumen of the larynx, usually seen at the level of the vocal cord, right? It's usually seen at the level of the vocal cord, right? So, and that membranous web-like tissue, which occurs to form the anomaly called laryngeal web, is derived as a result of the proliferation of the endodermal cells, right? So that is that one. The number three is tracheoesophageal fistula. Tracheoesophageal fistula, which is TEF, TEF is an abnormal communication or connection between the trachea and the esophagus. It's an abnormal connection between the trachea and the esophagus, which occurs as a result of the defective development of the tracheoesophageal septum, which is mostly formed by the failure of the fusion of the tracheoesophageal fold. Because when there is failure of the fusion of the tracheoesophageal fold, there will be no formation of the tracheoesophageal septum, thereby leading to fistula or abnormal connection between the esophagus and the larynx. It mostly appears in this manner, like this is the trachea, the esophagus will fuse in this manner. There will be abnormal connection, right? This is the esophagus. This is the trachea, right? So there will be an abnormal connection, and this is the point of the fistula. This is the point of the fistula, leading to a tracheoesophageal fistula, right? Because there is a failure of the fusion of the tracheoesophageal fold, thereby leading to defective development of the tracheoesophageal septum, causing tracheoesophageal fistula, right? So the next one is trachea stenosis. Stenosis simply means narrowing, right? So trachea stenosis is an anomaly which occurs as a result of the anterior deviation of the tracheoesophageal septum, right? It occurs as an anterior deviation of the tracheoesophageal septum. So the next one, which is number 5, is trachea atresia. Trachea atresia simply means trachea blockage. Recall that trachea stenosis simply means trachea narrowing, right? So trachea atresia occurs as a result of the presence of the web-like tissue in the lumen of the trachea, thereby causing obstruction of the trachea, right? And recall that that membranous web-like tissue is developed as a result of the proliferation of the endodermal cells that lines the trachea. So these are the clinical correlation or the developmental anomaly that is associated with the development of the larynx and the trachea. So I believe you enjoyed the class. You have treated it. This is how the trachea and the larynx get involved, right? Thank you so much for staying to the end of this class. I really appreciate.